Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and welcome to our third installment of my Week in Review, where I will look at the last 7 articles I wrote in the last 7 days on founderoftheday.com, and I'll give you a brief summary of it. So let's get started. Last Saturday, I wrote about Amelia Simmons. Amelia Simmons published the first American cookbook, titled American Cookery, and then it had a very long name. The Art of Dressing Viands, Fish, Poultry, and Vegetables, and the Best Modes of Making Pastes, Puffs, Pies, Tarts, Puddings, Custards, and Preserves, and all kinds of cakes, and that's about half of it. That's only half of the title. They used to be serious about titles. But what's really interesting about Amelia Simmons, well, there's two very interesting things. First of all, the first American cookbook, which up until this point, all the cookbooks used in North America had been published, at least in British North America, had been published in London and were English recipes. But Amelia publishes an American cookbook that has American recipes. The second interesting thing about her is that we don't know anything about her, almost. We only know what is in the introduction of the book. So she was an orphan, and she became a housemaid, and that's where she learned to cook, apparently. And she just learned on the job, and eventually decided to publish a book. So it was also one of the first times a woman ever published in their real name. So it's so shocking, because not only was it a woman publishing a book, and we don't seem to know about her, but it was the first American cookbook, and we don't seem to know anything about her. But even on top of that is what she brought to the American lexicon, specifically when it comes to culinary establishments. For example, she had several pies that we would know today as pumpkin pie. It was the first time that was published. She used a word that seems to be a translation of a Dutch word, which is cookie. This is where the word cookie comes from, because in America, apparently, according to my research, and I am not a culinary expert, but apparently in other countries that speak English, what we call a cookie, they might call a biscuit. And other, Australia says something different, and I will say, it seems that Scotland, about this time, did start using the word cookie in a similar fashion to the one we use, but it seems like, although it was published in Connecticut, which is New England, and has a lot of New England recipes, there are also heavily Dutch influences, which would have been in the Hudson Valley of New York. So we're not really sure if she was from Connecticut or New York. But either way, she gave us cookies. Addition to that, she's the first one to talk about a cranberry type of sauce going with turkey, which is now Thanksgiving staple in America. And she also talked about the word escapes me, but it was basically an early baking powder. She talked about potash, a leavening agent to leaven bread. And it was kind of a chemical way to leaven bread, which eventually inspired the development of baking powder. So that's Amelia Simmons and the first American cookbook. Really, 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 really interesting, even though we don't know a lot about her. So Sunday I wrote an article. I'll do this periodically, like once every 6 months or so. I just wrote an article about what's going on Founder of the Day to my readers. I told them about my YouTube channel. Not all of them might know. I try to promote it. They might not know. I talked about how I will be at History Camp Boston in March on a panel, which is cool, and other things about myself that I've talked about on this channel. I won't waste your time. Starting Monday, I started a series of articles on Paul Revere. Now, we know Paul Revere. He is the Midnight Rider. But he also he went on over a dozen rides of various times of day. So I wrote an article about his first ride to Philadelphia, which is in May of 1774. There was the Boston Port Act came to Boston, which closed Boston off. And the people of Boston, at least the Patriots, said, this is crazy, we gotta do something about this. So they gave Paul Revere a copy of the Boston Port Act, which said we're closing Boston Port, and a letter basically saying, a circular letter to other colonies saying, hey, if it's happening to us, it's going to happen to you. Let's get on this. So Paul Revere rode out to Rhode Island, then he rode to Connecticut and New York, and Pennsylvania. And from Philadelphia, other riders took it south. Now, because of this, first Rhode Island, and then Pennsylvania, and then New York all announced, hey, they resolved, let's have a meeting of the colonies. And this ride, in essence, helped unite the colonies, at least to the idea of calling together the First Continental Congress, which is a really big deal that Paul Revere was on that ride. Now, I then wrote on Tuesday about another ride where he returned to Philly, this time 6 months later. This time, the Continental Congress was meeting for the first time. And Dr. Joseph Warren, in just outside Boston in Suffolk County, had written what became known as the Suffolk Resolves, which called for, among other things, a boycott of all British goods. He hands it to Paul Revere, and Paul Revere gets on his horse and rides all the way from Boston to Philadelphia, a long ride on horseback, gets there, goes into the First Continental Congress. He was not a delegate, but he went there and said, hey guys, look at what we wrote. And it turned the tide of the First Continental Congress, because many of the people there were not ready for a revolution or a war or anything like that. They were just simply trying to get things back to normal with the mother country. So when Paul Revere shows up, it kind of pushes, especially the Boston delegates, but all of the more radical elements in the First Continental Congress, they all unite behind it. And even though there was opposition, famously, not so famously, Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania had the Galloway Plan, which more or less said we reunite with Britain, but we have a Congress here that is kind of the same as Parliament, but we still have the King. There's more to it. I will have to make a video on the Galloway Plan. But, so Paul Revere shows up, and then everyone gets behind what he says, or what he brings, which is Warren's Suffolk Resolves, and that leads to the boycott on British goods. That was the result of the First Continental Congress. Then on Wednesday, I also wrote about Paul Revere, which I wrote about his ride to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So, in May, he had gone to Philly, and that sparked the First Continental Congress. In September, he goes to the First Continental Congress and delivers the Suffolk Resolves. And then that December, he's back in Boston, but word is the British are coming to get some gunpowder. So was a common fear that the British regulars would take the gunpowder from the militias and they couldn't defend themselves. So Revere rides up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and announces, hey guys, the British are coming. And he wouldn't have said that, of course. They all considered themselves British at the time, but that's the story. He goes up and says, they're coming for your powder. So first, John Langdon, who would end up being a signer of the Constitution and was already a delegate to the First Continental Congress and a major player in the Revolution. The day that Paul Revere shows up, John Langdon goes to Fort William and Mary and takes the gunpowder with little resistance. The next day, John Sullivan, who would also be a governor of New Hampshire, had already, with Langdon, just gone to the First Continental Congress, and would later famously be one of the leaders of the Sullivan-Clinton expedition in upstate New York, a major general in the Continental Army. In the future, the second day, Sullivan goes and takes the cannons from Fort William and Mary. And this really had all the makings of being the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, because it was just 4 months later that Paul Revere would ride to Lexington and Concord, because the British were coming for gunpowder, and the Patriots would remove the gunpowder. It's astounding how similar these situations are. But that was his ride to Portsmouth. It was called the Portsmouth Alarm. Whenever they wrote out, they were alarms. The Lexington alarm after Lexington and Concord, the powder alarm. It was just them sounding the alarm, literally. Okay, so, without Paul Revere, yesterday I wrote Defacing the Defacing of Daniel Malcolm's Grave. So Daniel Malcolm is someone whose name I wrote down a long time ago. I found this list. I just traded in one of my cars to buy a new car. And while I was cleaning it out, I found this piece of paper with a bunch of names on it. And I said, I don't remember when I wrote this. It says 2:57 p.m. It might have been a decade ago when I was at the Freedom Trail. Who knows? But I Googled the names. And the first one that came up was, first one I Googled was Daniel Malcolm, who I had not known a lot about. And the reason is he died before the war started. But Daniel Malcolm lived in Boston in 1760s after the Stamp Act was passed, and Daniel Malcolm was not happy about these new taxes because Daniel Malcolm was a smuggler. Now, in Boston, smuggling was super common before this. What's often overlooked is when the British started taxing tea, for example. There had already been a tax on tea for decades, and it just wasn't enforced. So, when they passed the Tea Act, for example, they actually reduced how much they had to pay, but they started enforcing the tax. So technically, these patriots in Boston who were so upset at these new taxes, they weren't upset at new taxes. They were upset that they were enforcing old taxes at half the price they had originally been ignoring them at. Either way, didn't want to pay, and Daniel Malcolm was one of the smugglers who the local tax collector got together with the sheriff and went to Daniel Malcolm's house because he allegedly had some untaxed wine in his cellar, which, he probably did, but when the tax collector and the sheriff show up to search his house, they had a writ of assistance, which was another thing that the people of Boston in particular were very upset about, is Massachusetts had been issuing writs of assistance, which were kind of like a blank slate warrant. If you had a writ of assistance, you could just knock on anyone's door and say, I'm searching your house because I feel like you have something illegal going on in there. And these writs of assistance is why the right to privacy would be so important when they wrote the Constitution 5 years after this, quarter of a century later. Like, they actually not in the Constitution, it's the Fourth Amendment, unwarranted search and seizure. This is why. Because they would just show up with a writ of assistance. And what's interesting is if you were leaving town and didn't want the writ of assistance anymore, you could just sell it to someone else. And then that person would have your writ and be able to go search whoever they wanted. It sounds pretty crazy to us today, and it sounded really crazy to the Bostonians when it was happening. And Daniel Morgan was one of these guys. So when the tax collector and the sheriff showed up with a writ of assistance and said, we're going to search your cellar, he opened the front door with 2 pistols in his hand and a sword in his belt and said, try it. Just try it. The quote I read is he said he would blow their heads off, which I haven't confirmed that quote. It does sound more modern than something they might say back then, but Daniel Morgan also sounds like the type of badass who would say that to someone. So the 2 gentlemen leave because they don't want to get their heads blown off, and they go to the local judge and they get a warrant, a proper warrant. Because now they have probable cause, because why else would he show up with guns in his hand saying, get off my property? I know various reasons you would do that, but they couldn't figure it out. Anyway, they get a real warrant and they come back, but when they get back, it's not just Daniel Malcolm at his house. There are 200 or so other patriots at his house saying, you are not entering this property. You're not. So, knowing how the people of Boston like to riot and throw rocks at people's houses, the sheriff and the tax collector leave. And within a few weeks, Daniel Malcolm is absolved of all his wrongdoings. So, issue resolved. Unfortunately, this was in, I believe it was 1766, about a year after the Stamp Act. Daniel Malcolm would pass away at just 44 years old in 1769. I was unable to locate how. There's really not a lot of information out there easily accessible on Daniel Malcolm. Again, I write my articles in a day, so I can't necessarily be calling up the right place. I'm sure if I called the Old South Church or Old Church in Boston, they wouldn't know, but I apologize. I don't have that kind of free time. Not yet. Support me on Patreon. Eventually, maybe I'll have that kind of time if I could make this full time. Either way, Malcolm dies, and the British take over Boston. and they actually hate this guy, so they use his grave for target practice, which is shitty. Pardon my language. I don't like to curse on this channel. There's no other way to say it. They're shooting at a gravestone. And there's actually an image of the gravestone, which, you know what, I will put a picture up here. You can see the bullets. It's still there today. And it's funny because when Malcolm was buried, they buried him 10 feet below ground and wrote on his gravestone that it was covered in stone because they knew people were going to want to mess with him because he was an avid patriot at a time where that wasn't super popular. So that's Daniel Malcolm's story. Unfortunately, he misses the war. So I can see if you were saying, how was he a founder? He wasn't there. But, you know, the people who helped put in the heart and soul count as founders too, even if they didn't make it far enough to be a part of the rebellion. And finally, today I published Federalist number 62, a review, which I titled The Logic of the Senate. It's part 1, 62 and 63 are parts 1 and 2 of James Madison's final contributions to the Federalist. Excuse me. Now, he goes into the Senate, he talks a lot about why the Senate is the way it is, why it's even number of people, why it's, how elections are made. But there are just a few things I'd like to make very clear about it, as Madison did. Today, we vote for the President and the House of Representatives and the Senate. At the time, and up until, what amendment was it? 16? 13? Some early 1900s, they amended it, and now we vote for the Senate. But for the first more than 50% of American history, senators were just appointed by the state governments. And the reason for this is, and as Madison makes abundantly clear, the House of Representatives was supposed to represent the people. They had shorter terms. They were supposed to be not career politicians, just voted on by the people from among the people. On the other hand, the Senate was supposed to represent the states. They were appointed by the states to represent the states of what we would consider career politicians, or what they refer to as diplomats, or statesmen is how Madison references them. Statesmen who had a lifetime in politics, who understood foreign policy very well, who understood the national economy very well, as opposed to a layperson who was voted in for 2 years to represent their community, who probably had a business to get back to at home. They wouldn't have that much really knowledge of India, or China, especially back then when word traveled by boat. Excuse me. And the idea was, now there are checks and balances. So since all the bills were started in the House, it's not like the Senate could just run away and take over the government. But they were there to protect the country from these people, the House of Representatives, running wild and just passing all these laws real quick while we're here and destroying the country. And in essence, from my understanding, or at least what I've read recently, the Anti-Federalists seem more concerned with the House of Representatives destroying the country than the Senate, even though the Senate technically has more power and less people. And again, Madison's point in Federalist 62 is that the smaller Senate, full of statesmen, should protect the country from the people in the House of Representatives making mistakes. That being said, when the House of Representatives was doing things that were going well, of course the Senate should be approving that. Now, again, like I said, things have changed tremendously because now we vote on the senators. So it just casts a whole new light on it. Now everyone represents the people. And I'm not arguing for or against this. I'm just stating how the changes happen. Now everyone in the government is supposed to represent the people. But at the time, the House of Representatives represented the people, and the Senate represented very specifically the individual states. It was also additionally a way for the states to have some control over the federal government. because instead of the federal government just preaching directly to the people and then them taking over, now the states had some control. It's what makes our system federal. And in the Federalists, if there's one thing that's I get over and over and over again reading it, is we are not a national government and we are not state governments. We are a federal system. It's part national and part state. It's pretty incredible. And the one last thing I will add here is James Madison is promoting why there is equal in part of this Federalist, why there is equal representation in the United States Senate. What's interesting is the original Virginia plan at the Constitutional Convention, which Madison helped call, and Madison wrote the Virginia plan, even though it was presented by Edmund Randolph. He called for proportional representation by population in the House and the Senate, and he argued for it on the floor. He didn't do a ton of the arguing, but he did promote it and had his the better orators do most of it. I shouldn't say that. Madison did a good amount of talking. That's not fair. But either way, Madison was about equal proportional representation in both the House and the Senate. But it was only after the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, because it was orchestrated mostly by Roger Sherman and Oliver, I think was it Oliver Wolcott? The other gentleman from Connecticut, whose name escapes me. The guys from Connecticut basically oversaw this. And this compromise is what we have today. You had the big states saying proportional representation, and you had the small states saying equal representation. And the Connecticut Compromise was, we'll give the House of Representatives proportional and give the Senate equal. And here we are, 7-8 months later, James Madison writing to the people of New York, and in essence the United States, arguing for equal representation, even though that's not what he had originally intended. And that says two things to me. First of all, how important the national government was to the Federalists, how even if it's not what they wanted in the first place, we needed something, so we need to get some national or federal government in place that is better than the Articles of Confederation. But it also talks to me about what many politicians were like then, where James Madison was outvoted. So therefore, he went whole supporting the government that was decided upon. Now, and I know none of our politicians are listening today, but it is a note that not only they should listen to, but we should all keep in our hearts. That, if you're at a party and you want to drink beer and everyone else wants to drink wine, well, you're going to have wine that night and have a good time. So, I'm almost at 25 minutes. Of course, it's longer than I wanted it to be, but if you made it this far, oh man, do I appreciate you watching. I really do. If you took this much time out of your life, if you could just hit a thumbs up, give me a like, that would be awesome. It really helps spread my page. More people will see it, more people get involved with American Revolutionary history. So do that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's Friday, so I'm going to take the weekend off, although I will write 2 more articles. And I will be back, and I will see you on Monday.